This is ABC Radio Brisbane and Queensland with Joel Spreadborough.
Are you prone to a bad night's sleep? Lying there, staring at the ceiling, watching the hours slowly melt away. Maybe you wake up at regular intervals. Maybe you just never get the right amount of sleep or the length of sleep that you're hoping for. I'd love to hear your experiences with sleeplessness. 1300 222 612 or 0467 922 612 on SMS. How bad has it been for you? For how long for? How do you deal with it? Insomnia is a sleep disorder in which people struggle to either fall asleep or stay asleep as long as they want to. Most Australians experience it at some point in their lives. 1 in 10 people have at least mild insomnia at any given time. I'm keen to work it out, and I'm very happy to say there is an expert here to do just that. Dr. Jason Wessel, a North Brisbane psychologist who has completed a fair amount of study around insomnia. He's here to help understand the what, the why, the how of sleep struggles on ABC Radio Brisbane and Queensland. The number, if you want to chat to Jason, 1300 222 612 or 0467 922 612 on SMS. So, good evening, Jason.
G'day, Joel. How are you?
I'm okay. Now, I was just reading just quickly about your background. Sleep labs. You spent a bit of time in sleep labs.
Yeah. Research sleep lab at Flinders University and the Repatriation General Hospital down in Adelaide, where I did my training. Did some overnight shifts, wiring people up to electrodes, coding, sleep, things like that.
Wow. Now, the people that come into those labs, are they like they've got severe insomnia, or is it just a varying?
Not necessarily. Mainly it was sleep apnea, things like restless legs, sometimes insomnia, but often insomnia is more diagnosed through questionnaires, conversations, things like that.
What is it? I summed it up really briefly. Can you describe insomnia, the symptoms of it?
You did a good job. In Latin, I think that's where it comes from. It just means without sleep.
Okay.
So technically, it's just when you're not having sleep. Generally, it's defined as when you want to have sleep, when you've got ample opportunity to sleep, but you either struggle getting to sleep early enough, struggle maintaining sleep, or you wake up earlier than you would like to.
Than you'd like to. It's interesting. I spoke about the numbers 1 in 10 and everyone experiencing it at some point. Is it inevitable at some point in our lives, especially if we're working odd hours, night shift hours, or, of course, have underlying issues, chronic pain, that kind of thing? Is it something we can't avoid?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think we're born into this world insomniacs, with sleep being a struggle. Ask the parents among us. It's absolutely inevitable. In terms of insomnia, I think when we use that word, we tend to think of like chronic long-term insomnia, but you can have like episodic insomnia, which is just one night's episode of poor sleep. For it to start to become classified as disordered insomnia or an insomnia disorder, we're talking like 3 times a week regularly for minimum of 3 months, and that's when it's sort of getting pretty serious.
Wow. Dr. Jason Wessel is here, ABC Radio Brisbane and Queensland, North Brisbane Psychologist. We're talking about insomnia, which is one of your many areas of expertise.
Just throw that word around too readily, my friend.
I want to talk about the psychology. I mentioned about some of the underlying things like irregular hours, chronic pain, things that keep you up at night. Psychologically, what are the reasons, or some of the reasons behind it? Yeah,
so there are medical reasons, things like chronic pain. I mentioned restless leg syndrome, things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's related to sleep, chronic stress, psychologically, anxiety, depression, and then more day-to-day behaviours like poor sleep hygiene, shift work, I think you mentioned before. These are all things that can trigger and influence episodes of insomnia, and if they drag on long enough, then more chronic disordered sleep insomnia.
Okay, I've got Caleb on the line from the Gold Coast. A bit of insomnia in your time, but apparently you've found the key, Caleb.
Yeah, absolutely. How are we doing tonight?
Yeah, well, mate, just for the record too, definitely a palmy. Okay, I'll add that to the list. Thank you.
Absolutely. So for quite a few years, I started getting really bad night terrors throughout, and I'd get them every single night, like proper sleep paralysis, excuse me, night terrors. And then so I was seeing someone to try and work out, okay, what is it, and try and work out different ways to try and help combat it. But then I ended up finding out that there was 2 tricks that I could do it, because right now I can still, I will know before I go to bed if I know that I'm going to have a bad night. Now, there's 2 ways I can do it. I can either read a book just before I fall asleep, which helps ease it up, or recently discovered, I put on brown noise, a little bit different to that white noise, but brown noise, and then that sends me straight to planet Jupiter. Like I'm off with the sheep snoring, which my partner doesn't like, but at least I'm sleeping. So
yeah, at least you're asleep. Okay, that's really interesting. Brown noise. I'm not. My partner has a white noise machine. It's like the hum of an air conditioner kind of thing. I guess brown noise. Caleb, what is brown noise?
Brown noise, the easiest way to describe brown noise, it literally sounds like you're in the car, like say on the highway, and it's just that real dull road noise, as if you're a young kid again and you're sleeping in the back seat in the car, and that is the closest description that I can think of with brown noise.
Okay.
As I said, as soon as I put it on, I'm out within 2 minutes.
Wow. Well, thank you for that, Caleb. It's interesting, Jason. I guess it's not really a one-size-fits-all, I guess, when you come to solving issues of insomnia. Caleb's mentioned something there that I'm not familiar with at all. It obviously does the trick. I think sending off to planet Jupiter, as Caleb beautifully described there. Are there different horses for courses, different methods for people to solve their sleeping issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of it also depends on whether it's sleep onset insomnia, sleep maintenance insomnia, or early awakening insomnia. Those are like the 3 types of categories, I suppose. Sleep onset insomnia, or the difficulty falling asleep, is often related to your racing thoughts, anxiety, worries, and then, if it drags on long enough, worry about not falling asleep and being tired the next day, kind of compounding the worries, that releasing stress, the hormone cortisol alerting you even further, making it harder to sleep, and also contributing to wearing you out and feeling exhausted the next day. Whereas waking up in the middle of the night, sleep maintenance and insomnia might be related to disrupted sleep patterns from, say, like alcohol in the evening or nicotine, smoking, things like that. So it sounds like with Caleb, the strategy he used helped him fall asleep, using things that I would kind of refer to as circuit breakers.
Okay.
Things to quieten the anxious thoughts or the racing thoughts, like reading a book, usually a boring book. I know I've got some novels and I can't put down, and then I'm 4 a.m. in the morning still reading.
Yeah.
But then, psychology textbooks are pretty boring. So, yeah, absolutely. It's horses for courses.
It's really interesting that you say that. Let's look at complications. So you sort of hinted at a few there, the exhaustion and what it can do, like the way it can muddle you when you are suffering from sleeplessness. What are some of the complications we face? Yeah, so
for something to be considered insomnia, not just a bad night's sleep, there has to be some sort of consequence to the day after in terms of your functioning. Maybe it's poor concentration, maybe it's a reduced performance at work. But that's short-term. Long-term complications of sleeplessness or insomnia are things like a higher risk of anxiety, higher risk of depression, which is like particularly nasty because anxiety and depression also cause sleep disruption. So there's kind of like a spiraling effect that goes on with those ones. Health-wise, cardiovascular disease. I think there's even a relationship with substance misuse. So there's long-term, some pretty large implications. And we often kind of think about sleep quality as part of core health and mental health, along with good food as a pillar or exercise as a pillar. Good sleep is so influential in your general physical and mental health.
Dr. Jason Wessel, North Brisbane Psychologist, chatting about insomnia, explaining what it is, where it comes from. Now, I'll give my own example. I find that sleeplessness can strike the night before something important, something where there's a bit of pressure, a bit of, or excitement about something that starts early. So let's say it's a 4 a.m. get up. I try to go to bed by like 8:30. 100% will not get to sleep. Is that anticipation? Is it excitement? Is it anxiety? Is it none of the above? How can I define that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on your thought process, right? Anxiety versus anticipation. But, we hear it's, almost 8 p.m. You're trying to get to bed at 9 or 8:30 p.m. before an early morning. That sounds like it's getting towards shift work, even though it might not be, flipping the clock from midnight to midday. It's still a shift in your sleep schedule, and those shifts in sleep schedule have some kind of resistance. So if you usually go to bed at 10, 11, 12 p.m. and all of a sudden you're trying to hit the hay at 8:30, that's not going to go super well for you. So there might be some things that you can experiment with. So for example, if you know that a big day like that is coming up, to shift your bedtime a few hours early, just to try and coax yourself to fall asleep and not be such a shock when the time comes, as well as maybe sounds pretty cruel, but a bit of sleep deprivation to help you shift that schedule. You can do things like light exposure as well to kind of coax your body clock. But if you could try and make a bit more of a gentle transition, that may help. But we're talking about the circadian rhythm, the kind of biological parts of your sleep schedule. The anticipation, the anxiety, that sounds more like cognitive, what your headspace is doing. And then there are other things around, and this is a big part of cognitive behavior therapy. If you ever worked with a psychologist, they would work with you to give you strategies on how do you manage those thoughts and how do you quieten those things. And maybe brown noise, right? Try that. That sounds great.
Well, yeah, Caleb from the Gold Coast worked for him. And I guess it's one of those things, if you find something that works, latch onto it. There's obviously varying degrees of severity as well. How do we recognise the difference between a bad night's sleep and legitimate insomnia?
Yeah, so I mentioned before that there's got to be some consequence to your functioning. When we kind of colloquially talk about insomnia, what we tend to mean is something that's more regular and kind of dysfunctional, and it really does impact you. So to use the kind of the diagnostic definitions, we're talking 3 times a week, 3 months. So when you start getting closer towards those numbers, then we start getting more worried. It's more about how dysfunctional is your sleep systematically over a long period that makes us sort of start to prioritize it as something that you need to now put systems in place and strategies in place to maybe improve your habits and overall health. Because if you don't do these things, it's not going to resolve on itself. Whereas a bad night's sleep is kind of like a blip in the radar, which may well resolve itself in the short term or medium term.
Dr. Jason Wessel, we've got about a minute before the news. I want to ask you, you've touched on a few strategies that we can use, I guess, around bedtime. While we're awake, what can we do while we're awake and not necessarily in bed or going to bed that can sort of help us when it comes to getting to sleep?
Exercise a few hours before you go to sleep, or rather earlier than a few hours before you go to sleep. Try and reduce alcohol consumption, caffeine consumption. I think the 6 hours before you go to sleep, don't have caffeine. Yep. Cigarettes, try and reduce those. Nicotine is a stimulant. Alcohol might help you fall asleep, but it disrupts your sleep structure and can push you into what we call REM suppression and then REM rebound, which is kind of like it can trigger night terrors in some cases.
Okay.
All those there's quite a lot, and probably more than I can go through in a minute, but that's probably a good start.
It's such an interesting insight that you've given into it, and I hope it has proved beneficial for you out there if you do struggle with a bit of sleeplessness from time to time, Doctor.
No fun anymore, mate.
No.
Alcohol, no cigarettes.
Dr.
You
Jason
bore yourself
Wessel.
to sleep.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, mate, thank you so much.
All right, it's a pleasure.